Hello, friends in Ireland. My name is Mike Connolly. I'm a retired professor of history from St. Joseph's College here in Maine, which is located in Standish, Maine, where I taught history and political science for 36 years. I thought I'd talk a little bit today about the Connemara connection to Portland, Maine, my hometown, where I'm still living. I live on the edge of Munjoy Hill, looking out over Portland Harbor, Casco Bay, and beyond that, I can just barely see the fringes of Feeney Island and Calafinish. A bit about my own family. My grandfather and grandmother both emigrated from the Carna region just prior to the Chuk scheme. My grandfather was Coleman Connolly, and he hailed from Calafinish. My grandmother was from the island of Muinish, just literally a crow's fly from Calafinish across the bay on the other side of Carna. Her mother was Nora Lee. The family came down from Uachtarard to live in Muinish when some of the family had died in Uachtarard and they needed to consolidate the family. So the Lee family started that way in Muinish. That was Nora Lee. She married a Joyce, and after he died, she married, Joyce was William Joyce, and then after his death, she married Daniel Mulkern. And eventually, and we only found this out relatively few years ago, that she herself emigrated together with Daniel to Portland to be with her daughter, my grandmother. And now they're all buried out at Calvary Cemetery, which is the Catholic burial ground here in Portland. And if you were to walk around the old Calvary Cemetery, 90 to 95% of the names that you would see would be not only Irish names, but good Galway and Connemara names. And if you didn't know where you were located or what sky you were under, you'd almost think that you were located perhaps in Rahun Cemetery. Or better yet, out in the cemetery adjacent to Muinish, on the edge of Muinish Strand. So those are my family connections. I was the first in my family to be able to return back to Galway, which I did in the winter of 1972-73. I was part of an academic exchange program from Florida Southern College in Lakeland, Florida. And my professor was a Waters, which I later discovered was a good Galway name as well, O'Torish. And he was working in Dublin to set up a school of journalism. My family obviously is not the only one with Galway roots and Connemara connections. I want to talk about one of them just briefly. One of the famous ones, that would be the family of John Ford, which was the Feeney family. Now the father of John Ford, John A. Feeney, John Augustine Feeney, came from Torgdug, which is just on the western edge of Spittle. And his mother, Barbara Curran, who often the family claimed came from the Aran Islands, most likely came in fact from a little bit further west from there in the area that they called Bunnahound, but not the Bunnahound where T.G. Carher is located, but another one a little bit further to the east from there. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the Feeney family that we know of, and this is from the research of Margaret Feeney Lacombe, a local genealogist who works very much with the Maine Irish Heritage Center. She discovered that the first of the Feeneys to come was Daniel Feeney, who emigrated around 1842 and lived with his large family in Gorham, just north of and west of Portland. There was also a very strong connection to St. Paul, Minnesota, which the Chuk scheme is very well aware of. And Margaret thinks that the first of the Feeney families to go to St. Paul was Daniel's nephew, Martin Feeney, who probably arrived in St. Paul somewhere around 1850 to 1870, rather, to 72. So through that, we have quite a connection to the Feeneys in Portland and the Feeneys located still out in the St. Paul, Minnesota area. Margaret was in touch with Pat Richardson Vogel, who died around 2007, and she's looking to make other connections with the Feeney family. In my book, John Ford in Focus, we have a picture of a very large connection of the Feeney descendants who are living out there. So there's a lot of people who want to get in touch with Margaret Feeney Lacombe at the Maine Irish Heritage Center. Another connection between Ireland and Maine, not so much from Connemara, but an interesting connection, was that of Benedict, Maine, named after the second bishop of Boston, Benedict Fenwick. And his idea was to repatriate people from Ireland in the earlier part of the 19th century, from the land of Ireland to the land of America. And they were able to buy a large tract of land in potato farming country in the north of Maine, in the county called Aroostook. The town where they located, many of them, was named in his honor, Benedict Fenwick, the town of Benedicta. And at one point it was thought that they would be the center for a seminary there, but later that seminary chose to be located in Worcester, Massachusetts, the site of Holy Cross College. But that's a strong connection to the farming community of Portland and the farming community of Maine. Another connection was discovered and graphically detailed in a wonderful video by Deirdre Nichanila of Arran. And the work is called The Vines of Inishmaan, which talk about the Concannon family who came from Inishmaan and came first to Portland and Augusta in Maine, and then eventually made their way all the way out to California, where the Concannon winery is located today and produces large quantities of fine wine. They started out with sacramental wine, even during the age of Prohibition, and then went on to become a very large winery in the Livermore region of just to the east of San Francisco. I also want to mention the work of Dr. Kenneth Nilsen. Ken died a few years ago, very much too young, and creating much sadness in Boston, in New York, where he was from, in Portland, in Nova Scotia, and in particular in Galway, where he studied and lived for several years. He polished his Irish language at the suggestion of Tomás de Valderrama in the mountains of Connemara in Derryrella Woma, where he lived with a woman, Mary Joyce, and her husband, and became very familiar with the dialect of Galway Irish, which, according to de Valderrama and Nilsen himself, was maybe one of the purest forms of Irish, not contaminated by visitors like myself and relatives and even people who were interested in keeping the language going. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Chuk scheme now, if I could. I'm very grateful to Catherine Jennings for sending me the wonderful booklet that they put together on Mr. Chuk's fund, with excellent short articles by some of the best scholars in Ireland. Gerard O'Tooey from NUIG, especially Jared Moran from University College in Maynooth, and other local scholars and scholars of renown as well. That work puts into focus the emigration, in particular from Clifton and focusing more narrowly on places such as Carna. In Catherine Jennings' section in that book, she mentions, and this is to quote her, the potential immigrants from the west of Ireland had a literary problem, as most spoke only Irish and very few could read. Now, this is not an attempt to put down the immigrants from this area. It's a statement of fact. And it's a statement borne out in an all too familiar way with most of the Irish relatives here in Portland, Maine, the vast majority of them who came from Connemara. The three sections in particular would have been Cusharaga from Spiddle and Barna all the way out to Rossaveel and even Rossmuck. Eris Anach, further out between Kilkerran and Carna, including Moiris, Letter Ard, Mace, Half Mace, and the places where my relatives came from, Muinish and Calafinish. And then a third area would be up a little bit further north, the area called Cornamona, where a few of the Irish came, and according to Ken Nilsen, spoke a slightly different dialect from those from the other regions. And Nilsen his ear was good enough that he could distinguish between all of those three places. And he loved doing interviews. I first met him at Harvard in Boston, where I was forced to take the Irish language, not forced against my will, but forced to take it at Harvard because of the fact that at that period of time, 1979, Boston College was yet to have an Irish language component to their Irish studies program. They very quickly addressed that, but my wish always had been that Ken Nilsen could have been connected with that Irish studies program at Boston College, but that was not to be. We lost him to Nova Scotia, where he continued to do great interviews with the Irish and also the Scotch Gaelic speakers of Nova Scotia and Cape Breton in particular. Every time he would visit his family back in New Jersey, he would stop halfway on his journey from Nova Scotia here in Portland, where we interviewed probably 26 of the existing native Irish speakers that were still living here in the early 1980s. And some of those interviews made their way into some of his writing on the subject. For example, he wrote in my book, focused on the Irish in Maine, titled "They Changed Their Sky," which comes from a longer title, "They Changed Their Sky, but Not the Soul, Those Who Cross Over the Ocean." So Ken Nilsen's work, They Changed Their Sky, talks about the Irish in a subject titled "A Language That the Strangers Do Not Know." Also earlier, he wrote a piece called "Thinking of Monday," which was in Era, Ireland in the late 1970s. So you can check out his work on Portland. One of his greatest claims was that he believes that because of the source of immigration from Connemara, Cusharaga, Eris Anach, that Portland, Maine arguably had the largest percentage per capita of Irish speakers in North America. And I'm sure that people down in parts of Boston, especially Norwood and places like that, might find reason to quibble with that, but certainly Ken Nilsen was very impressed with the percentage of Irish speakers here in Portland, and now those have been documented in his work and other work as well. So one thing that I'd like to do in connection with the Chuk scheme, and thanks to Jared Moran for sending this on to me, I'd like to read two little snippets that make a connection between Portland and specific places in that region. The first one from a connection with Feeney Island, just off the coast, both of Calafinish and Muinish. So someplace that I can see from all of my relatives' homes when I go over there. Now, this letter was sent from Portland, Maine. in July of 1883. Very short excerpt. I ain't sorry for leaving Ireland. And if I got Feeney Island free forever, I would not go. There ain't a month, but we would have 20 pounds shilling. This, I think, speaks to the fact that many of the Irish who came did not go back. Maybe they didn't have the resources to go back, but maybe they were fearful of the conditions that they left, and on the other hand, happy with the conditions that they had in Portland and other places like St. Paul, Boston, and other places in between. One of the Irish longshoremen here once said, if they built a bridge all the way back to Ireland, I would not go. And again, it was not for lack of nostalgia about Ireland. They certainly did have that. And it was a romantic form of nostalgia, but they were content where they were located here and happy for their economic condition. The second excerpt that I'd like to read from you is another letter from Portland the very next year, May of 1884. It's a bit longer, but I think you might find it interesting, so I'll read it. I have to inform you that I arrived safe and sound myself and family here in Portland on the 25th April 1884, after an 11-day voyage of pleasant weather. We had fair wind since we left Galway until we landed in Boston. None of us was sick either. I have a house, my own, fixed up very nice, and I'm very happy and comfortable in it. I'm not sorry for coming either, for this is a good country, although I don't know much about it yet. And there will be lots of work here this summer. It's going to start next week, where 800 men will be working all summer, and I will be going to work there. So will my son too. I expect I will be a rich man yet, in God, if God spares us our health. This is a very good place during winter for longshoremen, all working on the English steamers, but they are gone now until next winter. I'll break from the excerpt just to say that my grandfather Coleman started work almost the day after he arrived on longshore, and the longshore work was very steady here from November through April, when the St. Lawrence River was frozen and Canadian grain being shipped over to England and other parts of Europe came down by the Grand Trunk Railroad to Portland, where it was held in great terminals, granaries, until it could be loaded onto steamships and sent over across the Atlantic. So I'll continue to finish his excerpt from 1884. My dear Johnny, I want to let your mother know that her cousin, Mrs. T, not named, and family are quite well, and indeed she and her husband were my friends and surely done their best for me. I have seen all the friends here, and all came with me that day I left Minish, and you never saw a better wedding in your life as they made for me, and I am much obliged to them all. I will have more news in my next letter, for I don't know much about the country so far. I am very thankful to a friend. He was a good friend of mine too, and he is a decent, respectable young man here in this country and doing very well too. He is respected by a good many, and his parents would be proud of him if they could see him now. These are both upbeat letters from people, one from Feeney Island and one from neighboring Minish, people who have settled in Portland and are doing well. And I'm sure that not all had that same example of success, but I think the vast majority of them did. And I think in looking at the question of why they came to Maine, certainly chain migration was one of the factors. Once somebody came and did well and reported that there was work, either domestic work in the hotels or at the homes of the wealthy on the Western Promenade or Eastern Promenade here in Portland for the women, or work in construction or working on canals, or in particular longshore for the men. These letters were well received, and maybe a little bit of money from America helped to grease the wheels and make it possible for others to come, like the Feeneys, like the Connollies, like the Lees, the Joyces, and so many others. Another reason, as in the case of Benedicta, was that there was land in Maine, it was cheap, and farming would be possible for those few who wanted to follow up a life in Ireland on the land with a life in Maine. So I think I'd like to conclude with just a couple of cases of social mobility. I started with those letters from the Chuk scheme, and I'd like to talk about a couple of people, two from Portland here, and one that's very well known by all of you in Ireland from Boston. I'll start with former two-term governor Joseph Brennan. His mother was Catherine Mulkern from Califinish, the same townland that my grandfather came from and that I've mentioned earlier. His father was from next door in Russia, John Brennan, who became a longshoreman and worked alongside my grandfather, Coleman Connolly. The work gangs that they were in were groups of about 16 to 18 workers, and his work gang, along with Coleman's, no doubt was all done through the Irish language because they were all native Irish speakers. Joe Brennan still lives on Munjoy Hill, and I can see his home from where I'm sitting right now. He's a good friend, and he was a great governor. The other person, of course, that is very well known to all of you there is John Ford, who I've mentioned before, with connections to the area around Spittle and just to the west of Spittle. John Feeney was born in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, just to the south of Portland along the coast. His family quickly moved back to Portland, where they were much more familiar and where there was a Catholic church, St. Dominic's, named after the Dominican Charles French from Galway. And they felt much more at home, living first of all in the west end of Portland, St. Dominic's Parish, and then moving just one street from where I am now in the east end of Portland, Munjoy Hill, which is in the Cathedral Parish. He lived here all the years going to school, finished at Portland High School, the same school that I attended. And then shortly after graduating from high school, he joined his older brother, Francis Feeney, who by then had changed his last name to Ford, probably trying to assimilate a little bit in the Hollywood film industry. And his younger brother, John, followed suit and changed his name from John Martin Feeney to John Ford. He's the greatest film producer in terms of volume in American history. He's earned 6 Academy Awards for Best Director, 4 of them for feature films, something that's never been duplicated. And his Spittle and Galway connections are something to be proud of. So the last one that I will mention is one that is equally well known in Galway and all of Ireland, and that's the example of Marty Walsh, whose mother was from Rosmuck and whose father, surprise, surprise, came also from Califinish. So a strong connection to my family, to Joe Brennan's family, and to so many others here in Portland. What he did as the two-term governor of Boston is very well known and respected, and so much so that President Biden has just recently appointed him as Secretary of Labor. And with the pandemic still raging in America and parts of the world, his work is very demanding, as you all know. I have done 3 works or 4 works on Ireland. 3 of them are academic works, but my most recent is a novel which takes place in Portland at the turn of the century in 1900. The title is Murky Overhead, and it tells the story of a typical family. I've given them the name Folan, but the story and experiences come from the Folans and the Feeneys and the Connellys and the Gorhams and the Joyces and the Mulkerns and the Flahertys and so many others from Galway who lived in Portland at that time. So with the telephone ringing in the background, I think that that tells me that my time is perhaps up. So I'm happy to have shared this with you today. I'm happy to be asked to do this, and I'm looking forward to the program that's coming out on the Truk emigration scheme. So thank you for your time today, and Gora Mila Margaret.